Hello everybody. Today we're going to go over section 3.3 and 3.4 of your notes. Make sure that you have your video worksheet out. I would make sure you write down anything that you would feel would be important from each section. So I will make sure to tell you when we're going to switch into our new section and kind of things that I would think you would want to go over to get you ready for your quiz tomorrow. So there's still a chance that I will be gone tomorrow. So even if I am gone, you're still going to have your quiz. But as a big hint, hint, wink, wink, fill out your video worksheet and be as thorough as you can. Okay, so today we're going to talk about section 3.3 first. So that's about energy flow in the ecosystem. So energy flows through an ecosystem in a one-way stream from primary producers to various consumers. So what that means is we're going to start always, every single time, with a primary producer. So that's either grass or some sort of plant of some kind. It could also be like this algae here, or lichen here. Anything that can be able to produce their own food, so that is also known as an autotroph. They're always going to start from the bottom, and they're always going to work their way up. So every time it'll start with our producer and work their way through. We'll go through various different consumers. So we have what's known as a primary consumer, which is going to be the first consumer that eats the grass. We also are going to then have a secondary consumer that eat the primary. And then we have a secondary consumer or an apex consumer, or you oftentimes hear it as like an apex predator. They are going to be what's viewed as like the top of the food chain. And what a food chain is a series of steps in which an organism transfers energy by eating or by being eaten. So it's basically how is energy moving through the environment. So we know it starts with grass. Grass is going to produce its own food through photosynthesis, and it'll then produce its carbohydrates, so it's sugar, and oxygen. Well, the rabbit comes in and it eats the grass. So it's going to get the energy that that the grass produced through photosynthesis, and it will then get it into its body. The rabbit will then hop along after eating the grass and gaining its energy. The Arctic fox will come in and hunt the rabbit. When the fox eats the rabbit, it is going to gain energy because the rabbit got energy from the grass. So the grass, again, is a primary producer. It's going to always be kind of top dog, brings in the energy. Then the Arctic fox scurries away and the polar bear comes in, and the polar bear hunts the fox. So it's getting energy from the polar bear is getting energy from the fox that got it from the rabbit that got it from grass. So that's why we call it a chain, is because they are connected, and that's how energy is going to be moved. It can be also moved in several different ways. It can be dealt with a willow, to a lemon, to an owl, to the Arctic wolf. So it can play out in many different ways as well. So the difference between a food chain and a food web, and I would make sure you know the difference. A food web is a complicated, interrelated food chains because animals eat more than one type of food. So just like us, we don't eat just cows or just chicken. We eat multiple different things all the time. And so we have to be able to interconnect all of these organisms together. Decomposers and detrivores are important to the food chain as other consumers. They recycle nutrients back into the ground. It's what allows it to be a basically continuous cycle and a continuous chain or web at all times. So even though they're not necessarily pictured on here, they are still important to the food web. If they disappeared, our food would not work, or our energy movement, the food we eat would not look the same as it does now. A drastic change at any level of food or any level of the food web will affect all other levels. So if we change one little thing on this food web here, it would dramatically change the entire system here. So let's say we got rid of mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are gone. No such thing as a mosquito anymore. Well, the butterfly orchid would have nothing that eats it. and it would probably expand and be uncontrolled. That also means the southern frog would not have anything to eat, and they would go extinct, which means the raccoon would have nothing to eat, which then also means the alligator just lost an entire food source here. So they have to focus more on carp. Well, that means it's going to put more on the flower here, which will run out, and it'll just basically take out the carp. So you can see how one little change, a mosquito. Mosquitoes are tiny, and we would all love for mosquitoes to go away, but they're vital to an ecosystem because of the food web they're a part of. So we cannot just simply get rid of them as much as we would love to. Okay, now we're going to get into the different trophic levels. We've touched on these briefly already within the last couple of days. So each step in a food chain is called a trophic level. So basically, we always start at the bottom and work your way up. A primary producer always makes up the first trophic level. So the very bottom here are your primary producers. So anything that is an autotroph that produces its own energy because of how much energy they can produce. So that's the calorie. So that's kilogram or kilocalories here. So it makes 10,000 kilocalories. So that's just grass alone. Then each level gets only 10% of the sun's energy from the previous level. So when the grasshopper comes and eats the grass, they're only going to get 10%. So that means they go all the way down to 1,000 kilocalories. So the grasshopper gets 1,000 kilocalories. Well, then when the grasshopper gets eaten by the frog is only going to get 100 kilocalories. So it's really not getting a ton. Then when the frog gets eaten by a snake, it's only going to get 10 kilocalories, so even less. And then we go all the way to the top, to the very top level. It's only going to get 1 kilocalorie, would be the hawk. So it's a big jump from grass that's getting 10,000 kilocalories all the way to a hawk that's only getting 1. So you're losing 10%, so you're always losing energy as you're going up in your trophic levels. Most of the energy that is lost is going to be in the form of heat. So heat energy will be lost into the environment. A lot of times the reason for this is because organisms need to release heat while we are digesting our food. And so when we do that, we release that heat, and then it's no longer there to be transferred in the system anymore. Okay, one more thing to go over for 3.3. We also have to learn about the pyramid of biomass and the pyramid of numbers. So the pyramid of biomass shows that the relative amount of living organisms matter at the top or at each trophic level. So there's more biomass at the bottom of the pyramid. What biomass is the different variations of a species or organisms within them. So we have our primary producers, which would be at the very bottom of the biomass layer. So we have a ton of trees. We have a ton of ferns and shrubs and grasses and flowers. And those are all, again, producing large amounts of energy. This is 9,000 kilocalories in here. Producing a ton of energy. Then we move up to the next layer of our primary consumers. They only have about 900 kilocalories. And we have like squirrels and deer and birds and mice. Anything that's going to eat the plant. They're going to have about 900 kilocalories. Then we go up to the next level here, where we're going to have about 90 kilocalories per square meter. So that would be raccoons and blue jays and foxes and frogs that would eat these organisms down here. So they'd eat those organisms, they're only going to get about 900 kilocalories. Well, then the tertiary consumer or the top consumer, the bear, is going to come in and eat one of these organisms here. And they're going to get about only 9 kilocalories per square meter. So they're not getting a ton of energy from eating these organisms here. That's also why bears tend to be omnivores. They'll also eat plants so that they're getting that energy that they need to survive. So, main thing to know, if something happened, and let's say we got rid of this layer here, if we didn't have that layer there, the primary consumer, this would dramatically change this pyramid here because we're taking out a large quantity of biomass and diversity, and it limits how much food these organisms here can eat and greatly decreases the amount of food that organism can eat. So we really have to be careful looking at this. So each living organism inside of it matters at each trophic level. But there's always going to be more biomass at the bottom than there is at the top. So you can see even from the picture, we have a ton of trees and ferns and grasses and stuff at the bottom. And then we get a little less as we go up to our primary consumer. Our secondary consumer is even less to our tertiary consumer, which is by far the least with only one organism found there. Okay, so that's pyramid of biomass. The pyramid of numbers shows the relative number of individual organisms at each trophic level in an ecosystem. So here, this picture will show your pyramid of numbers. So you can see we have 2,500 phytoplankton at the very bottom of our trophic level. So about 2,500, that's a lot. That's quite a few phytoplankton. And again, phytoplankton are photosynthetic organisms that produce their own food through sunlight. Then we have zooplankton. So they will eat the phytoplankton. There's only about 500 of them. Then the herring will eat the zooplankton. There's only about 50 of them. Then we get to the mackerel, there's about 5. And then we get up to a tuna that would only take care of about half of a tuna. So it's not enough to sustain a tuna, but it would be enough to get it through at least part of the day. So again, primary producers are always going to have the most inside of them every single time. So anytime you look at any of these pyramids, the primary producers are going to have the most organisms found inside of it. And it's going to get less and less and less as you're going up, as we're going up the pyramid. It'll go lower and lower and lower. Okay, so major things to take away from 3.3. First thing, trophic levels. So we start with our primary producer. We have a primary consumer that's going to eat the grass. Then we have secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and then all the way up to a apex predator. We also talked about food webs. Again, food webs are kind of a bunch of food chains locked together. With that, how they're breaking apart greatly affects if an organism disappears, it's going to greatly affect this entire food web. It doesn't just affect one small part, it'll dramatically change it over time. And then a food chain is just showing a singular movement of food. Now we know most things are going to fall into this food web because they don't just eat one organism, but this is a good way to look at it in a singular sense and seeing where that energy is being transferred and flowing through a system one way. Okay, so that is 3.3. So make sure you are now going to be filling out 3.4. Now we're going to get into cycles of matter. So we're going to talk about how does matter move throughout the ecosystem. So matter is recycled within and between an ecosystems. They're constantly moving and changing. Matter is not created nor destroyed. It is only transferred. A carbon atom, it's constantly being transferred. That is a well-known law that matter is not created nor destroyed. It is only transferred, or you'll oftentimes hear it say it is changed. Matter is constantly, at all times, moving and changing in some way, shape, or form to better fit whatever system it's in. So, for example, let's say we start with a single carbon atom is shot out of a volcano. From there, a bush absorbs the carbon during photosynthesis. So it takes that in. Then it takes it into the bush. The carbon will then get moved in, used as sugar. In photosynthesis, a caribou eats the bush. That means that carbon is now getting moved into the caribou. So the carbon is then passed out of the caribou in its feces. So the caribou goes to the bathroom and the carbon is out in the dung. So The dung is then consumed by dung beetles. So then the dung beetles are coming in and eating it and taking in that carbon. Then the beetle is then eaten by a shrew. So that shrew takes in the dung beetle and the carbon is then moved again. The shrew is then eaten by an owl. So that owl or that carbon is then moved from the shrew to the owl. And then it is released back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide when the owl breathes out. So that single carbon atom just kept jumping from one thing to the next, never staying in one place forever, constantly moving. Now what's going to happen here is when it gets released back into the atmosphere, it's going to go back up and it's going to start this cycle all over again. So matter is never staying still. It is constantly changing. So let's talk about our different types. Okay, so the first one is the water cycle. Again, you should probably know the water cycle by now. You've probably been talking about it since kindergarten. But that is the movement of water between the atmosphere, the oceans, and lands. So there are several different parts that you'll need to know. So I would know evaporation. So evaporation is where liquid water is moving through to the atmosphere. So it's changing from a liquid to a gas. Then we have transpiration. That's a big one. Transpiration is where in leaves are where water is collected. When the water inside the leaves evaporates and gets back into the environment, that would be transpiration. So it almost sounds like perspiration when a human sweats and you release liquid water and that could eventually evaporate off to cool you. Transpiration is basically dealing with plants doing the same thing. It's leaving water, or water is evaporating out of the leaves of the plants through the stoma. Okay, then we have condensation. So condensation, that is where we have our gas is going to collect up into the clouds and it's going to start transferring back into a liquid. Again, it's not heavy enough to start falling quite yet, but it is collecting up there. So it's just like when you're taking a hot shower, condensation appears on the outside of your mirror because the water vapor from the shower collects onto the mirror and collects into water droplets. These just collect into clouds. So that would be condensation. Then precipitation, that's when the liquid water starts falling to the ground. So it'll start dropping back to the ground. It either goes to the surface as runoff or goes back to groundwater. It can go back into rivers, lakes, and streams. And then it's going to then continue to then be evaporated back into the system and continue in this never-ending cycle. The major one that would probably be new to you would be transpiration. I would make sure you know that. You should know all of these by now, but for sure transpiration would be the newest one that could get you. Okay, so that was the water cycle. Now let's talk about nutrient cycle. Chemical substances that an organisms need to sustain life are called nutrients. Nutrients are water and carbohydrates, fats, minerals, vitamins, and proteins. So these nutrients are constantly being pushed through the cycle. They're constantly moving from the soil to the trees or plants moving to animals, and then going back down and breaking back down. So it's continuing in this never-ending cycle of nutrients moving through the system. Okay, there are 3 pathways we need to know for these nutrients. So we're going to focus on these 3. If you end up taking my environmental science class, we have a whole chapter or unit dedicated to these 3 cycles. So the first one is the nitrogen cycle. That is one of the nutrients that we talk about. The nitrogen cycle, an organism needs nitrogen to make nucleic acid, like DNA and RNA. So that would be the nitrogen base within that. Nitrogen gas makes up 78% of the gas in our atmosphere. So a large chunk of it is actually nitrogen, unlike we would normally think it would be oxygen, but it's not. This provides nutrients for plants. So NH3, that's ammonia, great for plants and their growth. And then NO3 is a nitrate, which is found in the soils and the waste of many organisms. So it's a great way for that to be broken down. And again, nitrates are made by the combining of oxygen with nitrogen. Okay, so with the nitrogen cycle, what's happening is nitrogen is being released from this bacteria, so denitrification. Denitrification is the conversion of nitrates into gas, releasing it back into the atmosphere. I would make sure you know that. So denitrification is the releasing or the breaking down of the ammonia and nitrates as N2, which is how nitrogen likes to be found in the world or in the atmosphere. And so it can then be released back into the atmosphere. Then nitrogen fixation appears or occurs, and that's when bacteria convert nitrogen gas into ammonia. And some of the gases of these live in solids called legumes, like peanuts and peas, and producers can use them to make protein. So what happens during nitrogen fixation? These different organisms, like this bacteria here, take the nitrogen in and create the ammonia or nitrates that are needed for these organisms. Oftentimes, you also need an energy source. So a lot of times, lightning is a great way for nitrogen fixation to occur. Also, when an organism goes to the bathroom, it'll then also have that nitrogen in it, so it can then break down and decompose into the ammonia and nitrates. So with nitrogen fixation, the reason we talk about the peanuts and peas or the legumes, they're great for putting nitrogen back into the ground. So that's why if you ever drive by a cornfield in the summer before they grew corn, a lot of times you will find that they will have soybeans growing in that field. And the reason for that is because they're trying to get nitrogen back to the ground naturally instead of having to put a nitrogen fertilizer in it. So that they're able to get the fertilizer back into the ground, the nitrogen back into the ground, and then it continue, so nitrifying the bacteria, and then it'll then go back and denitrified, or go through denitrification and break it back down and continue in this never-ending cycle. Okay, so that's the nitrogen cycle. The next one is the carbon cycle. So this is how carbon is moving through our environment. So carbon is a major component of organic compounds like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Anything that is considered living has carbon in it. So CaCO3 is calcium carbonate, and CO2 is carbon dioxide. Those are two that we are commonly have heard of, at least carbon dioxide we have. And these are the ways we deal with carbon pretty much on a daily basis. Dead bodies of organisms can be transferred or transformed into oils and coal and natural gas over time. So what happens in the carbon cycle is carbon from dead or decaying organisms can break down. When they break down into a waste product, they can either be created into a fossil fuel, or they can then be taken up, that carbon can be taken up by a tree through the roots and go through respiration. So plant will go through respiration and release that carbon back into the atmosphere. Again, when plants go through respiration, it is not as high as us when we breathe. It's always a lower amount, but they still need to release carbon dioxide as well. So that means that carbon dioxide goes back into the atmosphere. Then plants will then take that carbon dioxide back in. It'll then go into the ground, or it'll go into an animal or other organism, and then continue in this never-ending cycle. An extra part that is continued is with fossil fuels. The industries will come and pump it out of the ground and then use it. Then when we burn our gasoline or use it for factories or use it to create energy, we are then releasing that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And it's continuing back into the cycle. So we're always constantly moving this carbon around and around and around at all times. We have increased our carbon cycle, or increased the amount of carbon going into our carbon cycle exponentially by us burning of fossil fuels. So we are still trying to find ways to reduce that and what is better for our environment. Okay, last one is the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle is actually very interesting. So the phosphorus is essential for forming of DNA because of our phosphates that we needed for our backbone of our DNA molecule. So phosphorus is stored in rocks and ocean sediment. You will actually never find phosphorus found in the atmosphere unless it is attached to a piece of dirt. It'll never just be found as a gas molecule, always found in some sort of solid state. This is gradually released into the water and soil used by organisms. So, nutrient limitation. So solids need potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen, which helps plants grow, and if it doesn't have enough, it won't. So these organisms or these plants need these elements to be able to survive. If they don't have them or are limited to the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, they can't grow like they should be. Okay, the phosphorus cycle, how it works is if it is stuck inside of a rock, it'll then be eroded down slowly back into the ground. When it gets back to the ground, plants will bring up this phosphorus because it helps them grow, and they will then go into their leaves and stems. It'll then be eaten by another organism. That organism will then go to the bathroom and poop, and that will be broken back down into the ground. So this is how it would be on land. If this phosphorus ends up getting into the ocean, it'll stick in the ocean for a very, very, very long time because of it getting dissolved into a phosphate, and then it'll be eaten by a fish and then excreted after the fish poops, and it continues in this cycle. It will hopefully eventually get down into the sediment, and once it gets into a sediment, it will then create a rock. The rock will then get pushed up through plate tectonics and all those fun things, and then it'll then begin this cycle all over again. Okay, so most important things for 3.4. Oops. So the first thing, matter is constantly moving, constantly changing. Then we have the water cycle. I would make sure you know what transpiration is, and evaporation, and condensation, and precipitation. Again, we should know those by now, but double check that you go through those. Know the nitrogen cycle and those three types. So we have the nutrient cycle of nitrogen. I would make sure you know nitrogen fixation and denitrification. Just know that it's constantly moving through the system. It's useful for DNA and RNA. I would also make sure you know the carbon cycle. So that is carbon dioxide being released and taken in by trees and constantly moving throughout the system. And then we have the phosphorus cycle, where it is constantly being moved through the rocks to back to the land, back up, or into water, and then continuing through that cycle. Okay, so your homework, study for your quiz tomorrow. Make sure you have completed your video worksheet and you have everything written in there that you'll need. Make sure you have that for tomorrow. You're going to want it. Hint, hint, wink, wink. I will be back on Monday. If you have any questions, shoot me an email and I will try and get back to you as soon as I can. Have a great rest of your day. See you tomorrow.